Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of our Student Spotlight series, where we're able to showcase some of the new work that our past students have been doing. I'm Daphne. I'm one of the podcast hosts here at CCIR, and it's our pleasure today to have with us Emma. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, like how old you are, how long you've been with CCIR, what grade you're in, things like that.
Yeah, so I'm a senior at Liberty University Online Academy, and I had just finished a course with CCR the fall-winter semester with Dr. Taronas in the Racial Justice and Politics of Literature course.
That sounds really fascinating. Wow. And I'm curious how you found the program.
Honestly, I was just scrolling through social media when I found it. I had made some previous Google searches and whatnot, but yeah, through Instagram.
Amazing, amazing. And I'm curious, what interested you in your topic? How did you choose this really interesting topic with racial justice and literature? How did you find that?
Well, I've always been interested in literature. I'm a big bookworm, and I really wanted to dive into research in that area. So it seemed like a really great choice to dive into it.
That's amazing. And had you done something similar to this program before, or is this kind of your first time?
I've done projects in the past, but I have not done an intensive research project like this.
That is really cool. And so I'm curious to jump into your research project. Walk me through exactly as if I know absolutely nothing about it, which I don't. So just like walk me through exactly what you studied and how you carried out your research. I'm really interested to know.
So my research project was based on the comparing and contrasting the translations of Leucippe and Clitophon, which is an ancient Greek novel. It's not as popular as many other ancient Greek texts, but it's becoming slowly more popular and known. So I compared the very first translation that was ever made and one of the more modern versions of the translation. And then I compared that and connected it to gender and sexuality because this novel is very big on romance and there's a lot of different themes to explore.
That is very cool. And what are a few of these themes?
So gender and sexuality, but also consent, homosexuality, heterosexuality, identity.
That is really, really, wow, very, very kind of probing themes, I would say. And for those of us who aren't familiar with this novel, can you give us a loose explanation of the plot, just so we can kind of follow along with you?
Absolutely. So it's based on Clitophon, the main character, and his journey in love, basically, to gain the attention of Leucippe, who he meets at his father's house, and they go on a wild journey, I would say. There's a lot of different plot twists throughout.
Amazing. And what would you say this journey, if there's any symbolism or kind of like a metaphor for the journey itself, what would you say is the kind of aha moment, the like oomph moment of this novel? What is it trying to tell us about life and about his story?
I think that's really hard to define because this novel was written in the second century BC by Achilles Tatius. But I would say it's very different compared to other works that were written during that time because it expresses some concerns in society during that time, which I think was very proactive of the author. But the overall theme is basically adventure, love, romance. It's a entertaining novel.
Definitely. So you mentioned that it's quite different to other novels of its time, and this is second century BC.
Yes.
Wow, amazing. How is it different to other novels of this time? Like, can you characterize the novels of this time for us? Like, how are they usually written? Their form? What do they usually focus on? Things like that.
So I'm not completely well versed on the novels during this time, but to my understanding and what I've read in history books, it's there's a lot of books that are based more on the criticism of history during that time and the government, and there are other epics and adventure tales, but not so much more that focus on like romance, the sexuality and gender. There's other ancient Greek novels that do include romance, but I believe that those are during other time periods.
Interesting. So we have kind of more this one bucket of novels that are more hero based, journey based, the quote unquote history of X person, like a kind of epic, like, of course, Homer's The Iliad, The Odyssey, things like that, some classics that I love. And then this novel, on the other hand, is focused more on, would you say, relationships than one individual's history or herstory? Would you kind of characterize it like that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's based on Clitophon's pursuit and relationship of with Leucippe.
Very interesting. And why do you find that the author chose to, or if you could guess, let's say, because we can never really know, but why do you think that the author chose to focus on themes of relationality rather than this oneness of self? Why do you think, why was that choice made?
That's a really interesting question. Um, if I could guess, I would say he was trying to express something within himself about maybe themes of homosexuality or just trying to express things of society that he sees around him. Um, Trying to, I guess, create more awareness, perhaps.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think Greek novels, of course, are often characterized as in the epic form. I would say this: the hero's journey, fighting the monsters, getting back to his woman, back to his life, victorious and triumphant, things like this. um I think we definitely don't have a lot of stories of two people growing and living together and going on one journey together in this time period, for sure. So I think it's really interesting that you pull out these themes of potentially recognizing things that he's seeing in himself or in others, because that is, of course, another way where two become one, where he has himself but he also has society. So he's trying to kind of mold those two together, and that again is a two-ness. So he has that two-ness in his novel. It's really interesting. And have you noticed anything specific about the form of this novel, or is it written quite similarly to form as we know it, where we kind of have this beginning, middle, and end with a climax somewhere in that second half, or is the form quite different?
I would say the form is different than what we're used to today because there's multiple plot plots within the novel itself. There's not like necessarily a climax and a resolution. It's more so a few different plots along the way, kind of representing their journey. Um, but I would say there's a very defined introduction and conclusion, which is, I guess, the most similar to today's novels.
Interesting. And when you wrote your paper on this novel, what sources did you draw from to, gather your research? Because of course we have the primary text. Are there other scholars that interested you who were writing on this time period or this text specifically? Because I'm not familiar with this text at all. It's really, really interesting to learn about it. So were there other academics that you drew from, or who did you kind of draw inspiration from in compiling your insightful like paper itself?
Yeah, so the most recent translation of this novel is by Tim Whitemarsh, and he published it in 2001, I want to say. But he has a lot of more current information on this novel. So I drew a lot of information from his, well, one, his commentary, his book, and an interview he did. So I would say he had a big part in it, but there's definitely a lot of other scholars that contributed to my work. Like I forget his first name, but Foucault, he has a very big book dealing with sexuality and antiquity.
Michel Foucault. Yes, I love him. He's amazing.
Yes.
Brilliant. So are you referring to History of Sexuality then?
Yes.
Yes. So we have volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. Very, very massive book. Yes, I think he is definitely one of the most groundbreaking people when it comes to studies on sexuality and gender and society, how they relate to society and structures of power. So, how did you draw from him for this novel? That's really, really interesting. I'd love to hear about that.
Yes, so I didn't get the chance to read the whole book. Obviously, it's
Me
pretty big.
neither.
Um, he had a lot of interesting points just on general information about sexuality in antiquity, which was kind of what I was looking for, a little bit more just background information for me to kind of look on. But I did quote him a few times, just making my own observations of the novel.
Very, very cool. Yes, I think he definitely this text in particular, History of Sexuality, because he also has a lot of other texts like he has a book on power, he has a book on incarceration, different things like that. But I think this text in particular, he lays out for us how we have arrived at our understanding of sexuality as we know it today. If I'm sure you find that as well. And I think he, for those listening, I think he kind of draws out the changes that our conception of sexuality has undergone in the past few centuries. So how do we find that that applies to your novel? Where was this most relevant? Which parts of the plot, which kinds of dynamics in the relationship did you find were most affected by Foucault's understanding of sexuality, power, and society?
Yes, so the novel itself is really big just on sexuality itself. So, of course, I'm able to relate that to the society in which Achilles Tatius wrote, but I found Foucault, his information, his book, to be the most effective, just with a few observations in general, more so background information, like I said earlier.
No, definitely, yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm curious to know how, I guess, the author's name again? What is it again? The author?
Achilles Tatius.
Achilles Tatius, yes. I'm curious to know how you think that his view of sexuality differs to ours today. I think that's a really interesting thing to study. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Um, Not a lot of thoughts, but I was comparing mostly the two translations, but I was also looking on the perspectives of each author for the translators as well. So I think it more applies to their perspectives on sexuality because so the two translators that I was comparing is William Burton and Stephen Jassely, and William Burton wrote in 1523, I want to say. And so his perspective is from a society that is much older than ours. So that perspective itself was very interesting to look at, especially the dialect, because it's very Old English, and trying to decipher his perspective through a dialect that I'm not familiar with was also very interesting.
That is fascinating. I think translation is a really fascinating area of English literature. Um, and I think that okay, so would you agree that by looking at text and translation, we lose some of the original author's meaning, for lack of a better word?
I'd have to say yes, but then that's why I kind of lean towards what I call where what's called prismatic theory, where you have multiple translations of one text in order to get as much out of the original source as possible, which I think kind of helps with this concept.
That's yes, that's very, very interesting. I've never looked personally at two translations of one text for one research paper or essay. But I think that's a really unusual and interesting process to kind of sculpt a research paper around two translations of a third text. Um, so what were the biggest differences that you kind of identified in the two translators, if any, or were they mainly the same, or the same at least kind of idea? Or did you find any quite interesting differences in how one person interpreted one thing, and whereas the other like connoted a word that had a very different vibe or feeling attached to it? Did you have any moments where you were like, oh wow, that's not what he said? Or was it pretty similar?
I have to say one of the biggest differences was the word usage. Like you said, one word kind of creates a different feeling than what I personally might think was the right translation for it. Of course, some of the other differences include dialect, original source. Both texts use different original sources. William Burton had to translate from the Latin translation of the Greek text because the Greek text was not available during his time. And Jasely he translated from the ancient Greek text, but his translation methods, I would have to say personally, are a little old-fashioned. So that was also interesting to analyze.
How were they old fashioned? How do you mean?
He liked to take his own perspective on the text itself, and he wasn't focused more so on like the direct translation, kind of like his own personal interpretation, which was more unusual, I guess, to today's translation methods.
Interesting. So you were saying that one of the translators actually translated from a translation, from a Latin translation of the original text.
Yes.
Wow. So that is actually even further detached from the original, let's say, specimen that you're kind of trying to understand and dissect, because he's actually translating from another person's translation. So it's like a translation of a translation.
Yes.
That's very interesting. And why wasn't the original text available to him at the time?
That's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that the very first translator of the Greek text was um translated into Latin. Ooh, I can't remember her name. Um, Annabelle, I want to say. Um, but yeah, that was a really interesting find.
So it was a female translator was the first translator of this
I
text.
believe so. But they
And
used, oh, sorry.
sorry, what time period was she writing in? The first
Oh,
translation.
um, I'm not entirely sure.
Very interesting. Because of course, like as we know it, back in the day, there were not a lot of female translators out and about. So that's very cool that if it was a female translator to be the first one to actually translate this text. It's very interesting. And I have kind of a kind of abstract question for you. Why do you think so? Let's kind of define the canon for everyone listening. The canon is this set group of texts that we often read in high school and university as English literature students. And inside the canon, the Greek texts predominantly are the Aeneid, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. These are canonical Greek texts of the time. And I'm curious why you think that this text did not make it into our modern day Greek literature canon. Why do you think this text was pushed out from that canon?
Um, well, in a high school setting, there are several reasons why it might not be there because it has a lot of um, specific scenes on sexuality and gender. So a lot of schools may have deemed that not appropriate, which could have made other scholars shy away from it. Maybe they didn't deem it as a scholarly work in its own right. Um, but that's an interesting question to explore.
Definitely. I find studies of the construction of the canon to be very interesting and oftentimes very productive because I think what we choose to be the canon in our day and age reveals what we value in literature and by extension in society, I would say. So you're right. So by omitting certain things or deeming them taboo, it's actually making a statement about society as well, isn't it? And what society values and deems taboo. Um, Very interesting. And so I guess for a few closing questions, I'm curious your experience with the program. Did you find that it challenged you and kind of opened your eyes to doing something similar again and made you more prepared to explore other Greek literature and Greek texts and translations and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. When I came to this program, I was really looking for a challenge, looking to get my hands dirty in some research because that's really what I wanted to do, what I was really interested in, and I wasn't disappointed. Even though the course itself is based off of modern American literature, the TA and my mentor were both very supportive in whatever directions my classmates were interested in. Some studied Asian literature, one analyzed ancient literature like I did. Um, so yeah, overall, a very positive experience.
Amazing. And I'm curious if you have any tips and tricks for others. Do you have any pieces of advice for any students that may be just starting or in the midst of undertaking a similar research project to your own? So, any literature students out there, or even just general students in terms of research itself? Do you have any pieces of advice, words of wisdom, things like that?
So the program itself or research itself may seem daunting to high school students, but I found that once I really got into it, I had so much fun with it. And I encourage others to focus on having fun and learning because the whole experience is just about learning about yourself and these different topics. So
Amazing. Very, very well said, I think. That's very, very great. Yeah. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Emma. It's been very nice to meet you. And your paper sounds absolutely fascinating. I would love to read it sometime. So, yeah, I really appreciate the chat. It's been very, very interesting. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for the invitation.